today for office hours, I'm going to be talking about two different questions that I had in the work that we do with fuel calibration and working with the historical disturbance data that LANDFIRE provides. So just a little bit of background, and like Megan said, these maybe is a little bit more complex or detailed questions, so I'm going to go through a little bit of background just to make it easier to understand my question. So Pyrologix, what do? We do complete wildfire analysis, and we focus on hazard and risk fire modeling. And this slide and the next slide I'm not going to go through, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate that the two questions that I have, the first one has to do with the fuel calibration, fuelscape calibration that we do kind of in our different analyses for hazard and risk. And then the second question that I have has to do with a project that we're doing that works with fuel treatment, not necessarily prioritization, but kind of evaluation. In our work that we do, we take the data from LANDFIRE, and we use kind of some more customized applications with the fuelscape calibration and everything, but I just wanted to emphasize that these data products that we make, you can use off-the-shelf LANDFIRE data to generate these same kind of outputs. So it was kind of a plug for the fuel data products that LANDFIRE creates. So this is actually a slide from our fuel calibration workshops that we use to get everybody kind of on the same basis, that the fire modeling work that we do requires information about fuels. And so for LANDFIRE, and generally in most places, the way that we get fuels data is from the remotely sensed data. So this is the veg team data that gets generated, and then the fuels team, and also disturbance team. And then the fuels team generates the fuels data. So in our workshops, we refer to this as the magic blue arrow, where that transition happens. And my question today has to do, my first question has to do with that arrow. And so the way the arrow works is that we take either the veg or fuels version of the vegetation type, cover, and height, and then the biophysical setting, which is what my first question is about, and then the fuel disturbance layer, which has to do with my second question. So we take that information, combine it all together, and then we use the tool that's called the LANDFIRE Total Fuel Change Toolbar, the LFTFCT, or if you're old school, you might call it TOFU Delta. What TOFU Delta is an application that takes all of this veg information, says if you have a certain combination, then the rule set or the transition into fuels, you're going to end up with this fuels data. And so when we at Pyrologix start a project, we often have a calibration effort in there where we focus on these and kind of refine them working with the client. And so as an example, a couple weeks ago, we did a workshop with Region 6 for the Pacific Northwest region. They include the states of Oregon and Washington. And so we kind of define an area of interest, and we go and grab vegetation data and kind of look at it, and then also grab the fuel data that is derived from that vegetation data. And we do some prep work, and we bring it to the workshop, and we say, okay, folks, in your work experience and in your knowledge and specialty out in fire, and working with LANDFIRE data too, because many of the people at the workshop do work with LANDFIRE data, are there any known issues, or is there any improvements that we can make, or calibrations that can refine the fire behavior that comes out of this fuel modeling that we're doing for you, that will then influence the hazard and risk results that we produce. And so, like I said, there's that rule set that transitions the veg to the fuel, and that a rule goes with a unique combination of the veg inputs. So a lot of times for a specific, well, I shouldn't say a lot of times, sometimes for a specific vegetation type, within the vegetation type, how it's mapped, there may be some real ecological, biophysical differences within the vegetation type that people want to split out. We see this often happen with like riparian areas where it may be wetter in a certain spatial location relatively, and they want to insert different fuel rules for that area. And so the way that LFTFCT is set up is that you would go to the area that you're interested in, figure out the raster value for the BpS area, the biophysical setting, and use what's called a BpS exception in TOFU Delta. And so you would provide it with the value, and then for that value, using it as a key, you would give it a different set of rules. So what we run into a problem with is that we work in such large areas, either nationally, like at the national level, or regionally, that we often encounter multiple mapping zones. And we found that the raster value of the biophysical setting raster is actually a unique combination of the BpS model and the mapping zone. And so as an example, this is from our work with Region 9, where we were working with the 20 eastern states. Say we had a vegetation type 2305, and we decided that we wanted to pull out riparian areas using biophysical settings. So in zone 47, we would identify the BpS that we wanted to specify different rules for and get the BpS raster value for those. But then when we go to the next zone, so like zone 49, because we cover multiple zones in our area, we find that the raster value for the BpS are different values. So just to kind of go back and forth between that, you see that they're different values. And so in order to get that into tofu delta, we were kind of looking at many raster values. And going into the raster attribute table of the biophysical settings data set, I just wanted to point out that the value that I'm talking about that tofu delta uses is this raster value, which is a unique combination of the BpS model and then the zone. And as a side note, I wanted to say that I really appreciate the improvement in 2016 for the value that's in the BpS model. It used to be just a concatenation of the model and the zone, but now it actually lists all the zones that that model occurs in, and that's super awesome and super great, and we love it. So thank you for that. But we still run into the problem where for an area like the Eastern region or for the Pacific Northwest, where we have 9 zones or even many more zones than that, I think we had like 25 zones or something in ERA, we are having to determine a lot of values, have multiple redundant data sets. And so what we ended up doing was taking the BpS model, actually doing a lookup on the raster for that, determining what kind of value we wanted to assign to that, so like a value of 1 for this BpS, and then using it as a wildcard, and actually in tofu delta inserting the BpS exceptions as a wildcard rather than being able to specify the BpS directly, just because that was much more manageable from our standpoint. And so kind of a little in summary, I guess I understand the benefit of being able to specifically say, I only want the BpS exception in this one zone, but it seemed like it would be pretty helpful to be able to say, I would like this BpS exception to apply everywhere that BpS is, specifically to avoid seam lines, because that's an easy way to introduce some kind of seam line if you're not careful. And for us, when we do our projects, we end up with just one set of rule sets across the entire project area, rather than having a separate set of rule sets for each zone, again, for the same reason, to eliminate seam lines and to make it easier and more consistent throughout the project area. So that's my first question, is just kind of a discussion of, would there maybe be some kind of possibility? I mean, the way that we're doing it now works, and we can do it as a wildcard, but it seems like maybe there could be some kind of different approach to that. So that's my first question. And my second question.
Do you want to discuss that one now, or do you want to go on to the next one? I was going to ask a follow-up on your first question.
Either way, the next one is quite a bit shorter to describe.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll let you just charge ahead, and then I'll ask my follow-up at the end. Thanks.
Okay. And we can pull up any of the slides again that we need to. So the second question had to do with the annual disturbance raster data sets, which again is a super valuable product to us, and we really appreciate. And so for this project, we're working in the Rio Grande Watershed Fund, which is northern part of New Mexico. So Albuquerque is kind of down here, and Los Alamos, and then the northern part of this is Colorado. And so what they're interested in is not a future possible treatment analysis, but a past treatment analysis, which has been really interesting to work on. And so the three alternatives that we're looking at for them is a current condition fuelscape that takes all the disturbances in the past 10 years kind of along the normal process that is used in determining fuelscapes and therefore hazard and risk. So this is how the fuelscape is now. And then the two other alternatives that they were interested in is looking over the last 10 years. What would hazard and risk look like if only unintentional disturbances, so such as wildfire, wind throw, insect and disease, something that wasn't intentionally introduced into the landscape. And in this area, we only have wildfire, so it ended up just being wildfire. So what would that fuelscape look like in terms of hazard and risk versus what if we only had intentional and no unintentional disturbances had happened over the last 10 years? What effect do our intentional disturbances have? So this is any kind of mechanical treatments or prescribed burns where you're intentionally introducing fire to the landscape. And so just a little bit of a zoom in on that. You can see that this has wildfire. You see the mixed severity there that often comes from the wildfire severity data. And then the yellow is kind of any kind of mechanical add, remove. Actually, I think orange is add, but anyway. And you can see here, I just know that this area here is actually a prescribed burn. And so the prescribed burn areas are in red or pink, and those are kept, and then the mechanical treatments. And then in the unintentional, we only have the wildfire. So in doing this, for the years from 2017 to 2021, we followed actually the process that is mostly outlined, or we mostly followed the process that was outlined in Corey's publication, the Blankenship and Helmbrick publication on updating your fuelscape. But for the year, and because we gathered that data, we are able to easily split it into intentional or non-intentional because we kind of knew the source and what the intent was behind it. But for the years from 2012 to 2016, we were using the annual disturbance data that's available through LANDFIRE. And so using those disturbance code, which this is actually from a slide from a presentation that Inga did a little while ago, which is super helpful, and I've used it as a reference during my work. But the specific disturbance codes, when you go into the disturbance, it's super helpful that under the fire codes, there are actually different fire codes for like prescribed burn, wildfire, wildland fire use, wildfire, or wildland fire. And so we are easily able to tease out between the intentional and the not intentional or unintentional. But when I initially worked with the MTBS codes, in my head I was thinking MTBS was all wildfire, but it's actually not, it's large fire. And the way that we found this was looking at the fuelscape and knowing something was supposed to be a prescribed burn, and it wasn't coming through as a prescribed burn. And so when we looked at the codes, we realized it was coming from MTBS. So then we went back to the MTBS data, the perimeter data, and in the perimeter data, it actually specifies whether or not it's a prescribed burn or a wildfire. But in the disturbance code that LANDFIRE uses, the code numbers are used to differentiate between severity types and also kind of like the confidence or backfilling method types. But there isn't a distinction between prescribed and wildfire like there is in these codes. And so again, just in our use, we found it would be really helpful to have that kind of code distinction. We ended up solving it with a kind of gnarly reconciling polygons and rasters and not having edge pixels and all that, but it worked. But just a little bit of discussion about, is that something that could be introduced? Is there a reason it's not included? And kind of thoughts behind that. So those were my two questions. And I just want to say again, we use this LANDFIRE data daily. It's a great product, super helpful. And we know we bug you guys with a lot of questions, and we're so appreciative of everything and all the help that you've given us. So with that, we can discuss any part of this that would be good to go.
Well, thanks, April. I'm so glad you presented these questions, and it's really interesting because we learn a lot from the users. And so you brought to light a couple of questions that I wasn't really aware of. And so it's been kind of interesting to think about these. Could we roll back to your first question about the BPS exception? And I think the slide, this would be a good one to look at. You said you were using a workaround and using the wildcard. Did you do the lookup on the BpS code field?
The way that we did it was actually a little bit different. I feel like we should have done it that way. But we were using 2014 data when we initially did this, when we did the work, and then we actually went back and redid it with the 2016 data, but because we'd already done all of the filtering work, we kept our rule set from the 14 version. So we did kind of manual identification by BPS name across zones.
Okay.
To grab that.
So, I mean, Tobin can chime in, I'm sure, more about the total field change tool aspect of things. And I see that Don Helmbrecht chimed in the chat too, about, the new codes might help. But I think what I heard from you is that basically if it has the same name in your analysis area, ideally it would have the same BPS value so that you could tag it in the total field change tool.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds like you have an elegant workaround. What would be even more awesome, though, is instead of having to do the lookup, if maybe the total field change tool could also accept the BPS code, either BPS code or BPS model, but not so much value, because value in the BPS grid is not meaningful. But for you might use BPS code, but other people who do want to specify maybe some zone by zone BPS rules might use BPS model instead. So those are some thoughts I had, and I'm sure Tobin might have some other ideas.
Yeah, so currently the way it works in LFTFC is the value is what we're using to tie to the BPS grid. And then what name comes up when you actually select a BPS is the BPS code first, and then it's concatenated with the BPS name. So they're still separated, but the naming would be, 1908, and then it would say 15,180, and then north central interior wet flatwoods. But that would come up for each zone. So if the next zone ended up in 62, it would say, it'd be 1,919, but it would still say 15,180 north central interior flatwoods. So they would give the same name, but to make it even more simple, if we did the lookup on just the BPS code, that would definitely squish everything down. Although in the tool, the way the rules were calibrated before, not the way Pyrologix does the calibration, they were done by zone. So that would be the difference. Now, if people are using LFTFC, they could do a lookup on BPS code and then use that grid of the BPS codes in the BPS field of the LFTFC. The only issue with that is that it wouldn't have a name tied to it. You would just get the number when you go and look through them.
In the GUI interface.
Right, correct.
So, but it would actually execute in terms of like making the fuel grid and the canopy guide grid if we were to use this value in the BPS input.
So since this is being recorded, I'm going to say I am pretty sure that's the case.
Okay.
That it will work. Yes, I'm pretty sure.
I will test it for you. That sounds great. I wasn't aware. I thought perhaps it would break something. And so would it be something like we could have another lookup table that would then associate the BPS code, or that would just make things too complicated? And maybe that's a discussion for later.
So if you really wanted to put it into LFTFC and you wanted it to show up with that, with the BpS code and the BpS name, what you could do is, let's see, you could do a lookup on your BpS code, so then you would have an individual number of the 5-digit code, then attach back the BpS name, but it would also have to have BpS code. So your value would be your BpS code, and then you would still have all the same attributes. So you have BpS code basically there twice, but in one way it's in the value field. And then you would also have your names and all that kind of stuff, and that should work for you.
Okay,
but it's just
great.
Taking a little bit of time to add the attribute to it.
No, that makes sense. But I think that would work well for us.
April, this is Don. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Hey, I just have one other thought on this, is that, and this may or may not matter to you, but you can have the same BpS code for different BpS models. I'm not seeing that in your example here, but that does occur. So the really unique identifier is the BpS model under, and Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're thinking about it from the utility of the new BpS models, I would say, this could be reclassified on BpS model and assign a unique value, raster value, and that way each pixel is associated with a unique vegetation dynamics model.
So what I heard though was that April they were using one rule set per type. So you didn't want to distinguish by model?
Well, so maybe this might just be ignorance on my part. So what Don said, just let me repeat it back to make sure I heard right, is there's a BpS code field and a BpS model field, and there may be there obviously is kind of a many-to-one. Well, there's a one-to-one relationship here where this number, where it's listed, only has one value here. But Don, you're saying that it could be a different list of zones?
Yes, it could be one-to-many. So 15,180, for example, could be 15,180 for a zone you don't see in that list. It's just not occurring on your landscape or in this screenshot right now, but that is true. But again, going back, I don't know if that's important from the fuel standpoint at all, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It's important for the, departure modeling standpoint for sure.
So I think, given that description, I think we would be interested in using the code. So would it have a different BpS name then because the model is different?
So
no, it has the same name.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the way it kind of works is, say for this one, North Central Interior Wet Flatwoods, it gets a BpS code 1518, and that 1518 identifies the unique BpS North Central Interior Wet Flatwoods. North Central Interior Wet Flatwoods occurs across multiple zones. And if there are different vegetation dynamics models in different zones, that would be identified in the BpS model field. So for example, instead of having this long list of zones, you might have 1518 underscore 43, 47, 49. And then you'd have another one that could be 1518 underscore 52, 62, 63. So I have a BpS raster I could probably bring up and show, but because yours are all kind of one-to-one between the BpS code and BpS model. But if you look, you'll find many exceptions in that, so that across the whole range, for example, of wet flatwoods, you could have different fire return intervals, disturbance factors. A good example would be like, for my part of the world, Northern Rocky Mountains, dry mesic mixed conifer. And we kind of a version of that for the Northwest. It creeps down into the Klamath. That has its own version. Over more in the Panhandle in Montana, that's a different model.
Okay.
So you'll have different zone numbers associated with those variants, but they're all dry music mixed conifer.
Okay. And then the boundary that's used in the transition between those would be the map zone boundary.
Yes.
Okay.
So
okay.
if you want, if the zone BpS, zone distinction and unique model distinction doesn't matter, then BpS code does work for you. But like Dawn said, if you're interested, maybe down the line as part of your analysis, you're doing vegetation departure, those zone numbers do matter, and you need to look at the unique BpS model.
That makes sense, and that's great to know, because I can see that if there's difference in vegetation, like a fire return interval and things like that, that I could see people wanting to have a different rule set for that area. So I feel like it would kind of be a case-by-case basis on whether or not it would introduce a seam line to make a difference, and whether or not they're acknowledging some kind of difference in the behavior that they're observing out there.
Another thing that might may or may not help in the future, and it'd be interesting to get some feedback from those on the call, is we carried over the zone field here as kind of a legacy to the way we used to create this BpS raster. But you don't necessarily need it because you can identify the zone in the BpS model. And with the zone field in there, it creates all these duplicates that that are not unique models. So like ideally you'd have a row just for each BpS model, but we end up with, in your example of the North Interior wet flatwoods, is that like 8 rows or something of duplication. And if you took out the zone field, you'd have 1 row, which would get to part of your problem. But it would definitely simplify the raster. So in the future, that's one thing we've discussed is, should we do away with that zone field and all the duplication in rows that it creates? But I'd be curious to hear from those who use it, and maybe from the, total field change tool perspective. Would that be helpful or not helpful?
Yeah, Corey, that's what I think that's kind of what I was getting at in the chat with this being sort of an artifact.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that, I think it would be helpful if the actual raster value, was a 1-to-1 with BpS model at this point. Because right now it's sort of like the combination, like you said, of BpS code and zone gets a unique value in the raster. But that's not really the BpS models we're working with anymore. So yeah, I think it would be helpful to see that change. And then, Tobin would just have to get the correct lookup tables and things for the tool, after that change is made, to update the tool. I'm curious to hear from others on that.
Yeah, that could work, actually. I'm just trying to think what it would break. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Here, I don't want people to get the wrong opinion here. There we go. I don't work for the fire lab. I used to, but not anymore. If the zone field was left off of the attribute table, that would be fine, because what LFTFC is looking for is the value field, the BpS code, and the BpS name. It's those 3 fields.
But for all the fuel rule sets that you have by zone, the BpS exceptions that are in there by default, those would need to be updated to use the model, the BpS model identifier rather than the combination of zone and model.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, because there are a bunch of rules that are already out there, and it keys into that value field, that value code. But if you were doing it, like you said, just individually or on a separate project basis, you could just swap the BpS code into the value code, and then that should work okay.
So I'm noticing we're about halfway through our hour here, and wondering if we should move on to your second question, or if there's anyone else on the call that would like some more clarification on this first question. Please don't be shy. The whole point is to ask questions and help get these answers for everyone.
So this is Inga. I just wanted to say, Don, I hear what you're saying, and, you know, like kind of creating a lookup between the old values and some new values that would match the BpS model. So I think that, yeah, that's definitely something to consider. But yeah, what would it break? That is the question.
Well, we could run a test on it.
Yeah.
I could work with Tobin and we could test it, I think, pretty easily.
Yeah. Would that solve, April, if they match the BpS model attribute? That would solve your...
I think so. I mean, I think there may be cases where, like Don and Corey were discussing, where we still might be condensing it down or listing multiple models under a single BpS code if we had to intentionally avoid a zone seam line. Gotcha. But in general, it would much simplify what we are doing to be able to do that.
Cool.
Now, I could just jump in. I think, you know, I love the question, April. I think this is awesome. So I appreciate you bringing it up. And I like what I'm hearing, you know, with Corey and Tobin and Don, and, you know, I think they're talking about doing some testing. I think that's the logical next step, because we do need to understand. I hear the benefit. It sounds like this could be really beneficial in a number of ways, but we do need to consider, you know, what the consequences of that are. So I think doing some evaluation testing, we can kind of do that as a next step, and then, you know, at some point in the future, and then circle back with this group, or maybe send a future office hours that we do, you know, another little session to talk through some of this. But I really like, you know, where this is going right now. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you guys for entertaining the conversation. I appreciate that as a user.
I do have
go ahead.
an answer. I have an answer to the second question.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Let's take a look at that one.
I'm not sure if there's a slide that would be helpful or not, or if you want to.
Yeah, no, go back to that list.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I asked the same question at one point. And, you know, I think originally there were some doubts about the MTBS cause attribution, disturbance cause attribution. And so there was some hesitation about trying to incorporate those parameters into our events geodatabase at the beginning. So, and it would basically, you know, change this whole chart, right? So and right now, everything that's at the top is, you know, it basically the priority goes top down. So of what you see in disturbance. And so that would have to change as well. And it would have to have a combination of MTBS and the event as a new code, essentially. So that's the reason why it hasn't changed yet. I don't know that it can't change, but it would mess up kind of like being able to compare old codes to new codes, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. It's just that's probably why it hasn't happened yet.
Which is a very, I can appreciate the difficulty that would introduce on many levels.
But I do think it's important for us to figure that out and try to pull out which MTBS are prescribed and which are wild, because we do that for everything else. So, you know.
And like I said, our use instance is kind of very specific, but it seemed like there could be other users trying to get the same kind of information.
Yeah, and I've actually,
I've
seen a paper where they had to go back and get the parameters and.
Oh yeah.
So it's not, you're not the only one.
Yeah, I'm working on an analysis right now where it would be useful to distinguish those. And I did not realize that it wasn't distinguished either. But I was able to duplicate what you found, April, just in a little sample area that I was testing where there's a large prescribed fire, because I think it still has to meet the size threshold for MTBS. And it's in the 2016, it's a 2016 event, and it shows up as a wildfire, but it's clearly a prescribed fire in MTBS, but LANDFIRE maps it as a wildfire, not a prescribed fire.
And like several people have mentioned, there's definitely the workaround with grabbing those MTBS parameters and doing some selection and mass and stuff like that, but you just have to be GIS savvy and careful, otherwise you'll end up with like a ring of a wildfire around prescribed fire.
Well, you also have to know it's a problem, because like for my application, I was just mapping the different disturbance types, the different fire disturbance. I had wildfire and prescribed fire and wildland fire use. And because prescribed fire was one of the disturbance types, I assumed that was really capturing prescribed fire. But it's not capturing all prescribed fire. But I guess with that prescribed fire category, what you are capturing is everything less than 1,000 acres that we can find based on events. So basically prescribed fire in LANDFIRE's disturbance is coming from events data, like what's mined out of facts and NIF pores and stuff like that.
Right. But the fact that MTBS trumps those,
right,
where it occurs is where the problem comes in. Yeah.
Right. So those that are larger than 1,000 acres in the West.
Because that's what we saw, was that we had this event data indicating it should be prescribed, but our final FDIS was coming through as not being prescribed.
April, can you give an example of the different, how you're assigning fuel rules differently, whether it's prescribed fire or wildfire? Because really, the fuel rules are really based on the severity and time since disturbance. So I'm wondering if how you're teasing that out, or why that's important to tease out.
Yeah, so it actually doesn't have to do with the rules so much, just as the generation of the FDIS layer, because we use the same rule sets for all three alternatives. But because we're changing our FDIS, when we do the disturbance rule lookup, we're going to end up with different codes in our final fuel model, right? Because, for example, in this pixel right here, right now it probably has like 123 for the disturbance code. Moderate severity fire, TSD 3, so it's 5 to 10 years old. And so that's the FDIS that was used here. So when the fuel model gets looked up here, it's under the 123 FDIS assignment. And so in here, we end up with the same assignment with the 123. So we end up with the same fuel model. But in here, that disturbance gets removed because it was an intentional disturbance. And so the fuel model lookup that occurs here is under the non-disturb, the FDIS 0. And so we actually get a different fuel model in our three alternatives.
Oh, I see. And I think I missed some when you talked about the intentional versus unintentional. So that might be.
I went through it kind of quickly. So then the idea is that we then take those fuel models and do the hazard, the fire modeling and hazard assessment. And so we can kind of say, and this is, we're still developing this, but, just saying, this much change in your fuelscape can somewhat be attributed to the disturbance you've intentionally introduced
to
your fuelscape.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, no problem. And it was actually, it's been a little bit of a mind bender because, as probably all you know, in 10-year time span, you can have multiple disturbances, but only one disturbance assignment. And so in cases where we have multiple disturbances, you could actually end up with 3 different assignments, or not 3 different assignments, but so if you had like a thinning 7 years ago, and then 2 years ago you had a moderate severity fire, then the moderate severity fire would be used in the full and in the unintentional, but rather than going to F to 0 in the unintentional, you have to go back to the moderate thinning in that field skip. So it's been fun, but a little bit of a brain teaser.
There is that new HDist layer, historical, and I don't know, I haven't really played around with it, but I wonder if that would be helpful at all. Maybe Tobin can explain that more, or you've probably looked at it.
Well, that's what we actually generate our own, because we're bumping the time frame forward, so we have to generate our own HDist. But yeah, I think it would be good for the office hours to have someone talk about that a little bit, because it's been super helpful for us in determining that kind of logic.
So I am wondering, it definitely seems like there's an issue on our end, and Inga brought up the issue of, well, if we now try to distinguish it, it makes things not backward compatible. But Inga, I'm wondering if we introduce a prescribed fire identified by MTBS as a new code, you don't actually like change any of the old codes, but you introduce it as a new code. Could we do that? And then it would be identified moving forward. And I ask that because I think that's happened before. I've just analyzed all the annual disturbance from 1999 to 2016, and the code, new codes have been added, and they just have to be kind of like, you have to, identify that in your analysis and crosswalk them. But if this new prescribed fire MTBS was added as a brand new code, it seems like it could be mapped going forward and not cause too much trouble. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, it should be possible for sure. It's just, if you see, so yeah, it would have to be maybe, yeah, it's just shifting things around a little bit still. I don't know, maybe I can talk to, I know there was some concern from Brenda and from Brian on that, but I can talk to them again and kind of see if there's a workaround that we can come up with.
So Randy Swati here with a kind of a quick note to self that I'll say out loud. Thanks so much for bringing up these questions. And I keep thinking, okay, what if I were kind of new to LANDFIRE? This might sound like Greek. And I just note to self that it might be good for us to create a series of videos about the data sets and attribute tables, thinking back to the BpS question, just to give people a tour of what the codes mean. I know we have the metadata that's pretty good, but still it's not like a human voice. Metadata always reads a little bit difficult to me. So anyways, just note to self, I would love to hear from others in the chat if you've thought the same thing, or you can imagine ways that we can help people work with some of these data sets. Would love to hear a brainstorm or see a brainstorm in the chat.
Also want to make sure that we have about, we give ourselves 45 minutes, but we have the option to go to an hour. So I just want to make sure that anybody that came to the office hours today that has a question has an opportunity to ask it while there are experts on the call that can field those questions. So please let us know. Just unmute yourself and stump us.
I'm not going to stump you. I'm just going to make a point. And again, with this one, and I think what Inga has outlined is good, is to go back and have some conversations. For awareness, this whole hierarchy that you're showing here on the screen, April, really, really important. And it is a brain teaser for sure. There's a lot of relationships there to think about. And so we recognize that, and to be doing a review with NWCG just to think about, this hierarchy and what makes sense, what should be, in a particular order. Because I think what we've got is good. And like a lot of things, it's been super beneficial, but it doesn't mean that there can't be improvements on it. And so that's what we want to do, is kind of take that kind of a look. And so, welcome your ideas and others on this call if you've got different thoughts and ideas on, how this, hierarchy should be structured. We're all ears. We want to hear those kinds of things. So, but I think it's important for you to be aware that we've been on this path for a while. It's just taken longer to get this NWCG review in place, but the plan is to get that going, and then we'll see how far it goes. It could be a very, I'll call it superficial review, or it could be something that's a little deeper. We'll just have to see, how things go.
My follow-up comment under that is, it is kind of, I feel a little bit like I didn't expect to be able to so easily tease out the information I needed to from the codes, and then it was so handy and easy that it would be nice if it was easy here too. So it's kind of a maybe, oh, can I have some more? So I appreciate that functionality.
Something I'm curious about investigating more, and I know Tobin and Charlie have been looking at this. It's sort of related to this, is the mechanical disturbances. We've talked a long time about having the two categories, mechanical add and mechanical remove, and that it may be beneficial to rethink those categories, or even and maybe add a category, and also look at what's going into those categories. Because I know that with a lot of stuff gets thrown into the category of mechanical other in the, you may have to correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't know if that's in the VDist or just in the events database, but then, that mechanical other then gets put into, I forget, it's either add or remove. But when you actually look at those categories for the FACS, FAC, the Forest Service Activities Tracking System, for those not familiar with it, when you look at those categories and see what those disturbances actually are, a lot of them don't really fit with where they're getting put in the fuels, in the FDist. So maybe that could be another office hours discussion at some point, or I'm curious to whether there's any updates from the field shop on where that's going.
So yeah, that's,
sorry to put you on the spot, Tobin.
Oh, that's all right. I figured you would bring that up at some point. So yeah, we did include mastication as a separate disturbance, because that was included in the mechanical add portion of the disturbance codes. So that is split out now, and it will be mastication, and that'll be a 700 series code. As far as mechanical other, we have talked about it on various calls within LANDFIRE about having a review of those other codes that are being aggregated into mechanical other, and maybe having a review of those as to how they get assigned, because you're right. Well, and let me clarify for those that haven't looked at the mechanical other category. Most of the time, those are RISLIC identified, so just image detection change identified, and they don't have an event polygon associated with them as to what the disturbance is. So most of the time that occurs, it is a mechanical remove, meaning some sort of a timber harvest or something like that. It doesn't mean that it has to be that, but most of the time that's what it is, right? But a lot of things do get squished into the, I believe it is, well, that would be unknown mechanical, is what I just described there. And then the mechanical other in FACS, well, in LANDFIRE yearly disturbance, not fuel disturbance, which is another aggregation. Then there are things that can be considered a mechanical add, a mechanical remove. There's a lot of things in there. So long story short, we have decided that we will have a review internally, in which other people will probably be involved from other agencies and things like that, to kind of look at this. When that's going to happen, I'm not certain.
John,
And just, oh, okay.
what was the category you wanted to add? Was it mastication?
Yeah, I think that's helpful just because that's a different type of fuel bed. I mean, the thing is that, so mechanical add was considered, that's where mastication was going. But it's sort of like, it's almost like a mechanical rearrange. Because I think when a lot of people they hear mechanical add and they think, oh, well, so I'm adding to the surface fuel load. And with mastication, you are adding to the surface fuel load, but you're also, it's a change in how those fuels are distributed, right? So you're compacting the fuel bed versus that's going to have very different fire behavior, different fuel model assigned than say if it was a so like a lop and scatter, or all these activity fields are still on the surface fuel bed. They haven't been removed or dealt with in any way yet. So, and then the mechanical remove, I've always kind of thought of it as almost a little bit of a misnomer. Tobin and I have talked about this a lot, in that that's always used when there's a harvest activity in FACS, but it's the assumption is that the activity fields have been dealt with. So it's almost like a mechanical no change, right? So there's been a mechanical treatment and the surface fields haven't changed, but the canopy fields have changed a lot. So I don't know. And Tobin, Charlie, and I have thrown some of these ideas around, but it's just, in both cases, like when you look at the fuel rules, if you study the fuel rules, you're going to see that, even with the mechanical add, the fire behavior generally is reduced. And again, that goes back to the idea that, okay, we've masticated those fuels, we've changed the fuel bed depth, and it's a dense fuel bed. But, if you're thinking about it from some of these other disturbances that from FACS that get thrown in there, for example, like flop and scatter, then it's, you probably want to increase your fire behavior, right? Because you've just added a bunch of surface fuel to the ground. So anyhow, there's some nuances like that I think, it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier, in that it's, how much do you split and clump things to capture those nuances.
Yeah.
And when, this isn't super related to what Don was talking about, but what Tobin was mentioning about the unknown mechanical one, difficulty that we've run into a lot is, again, that's based off of, or often includes the image-based change with no event, and that's why it's unknown. But we have had some heartache with clients about insect and disease changes being picked up there, and then having to assign an insect and disease change, something kind of mechanical unknown. But I completely appreciate the difficulty of insect and disease data and availability and implementation and all that stuff. But that's just another little difficulty that we have in some of our work.
Henry, is that the FATET stuff's only on Forest Service land, right?
Well, it's principally Forest Service land, but they do some of those digital aerial sketch maps is also for some of the state land. So it's not exclusively Forest Service. They do pick up some other lands as part of that. But I will say it is predominantly Forest Service for sure, but it's not exclusive.
The insect and disease, yeah, that's kind of major data set for that. But some states send us, I think it's a lot of resources for states to put out there to try to map their insect and disease. So it's probably not as complete as as it could be.
Oftentimes we see that when the insect and disease is mapped, it's kind of like a containing boundary. And so you get this really large polygon rather than this is specifically where it's happened. And so applying it just really disrupts the fuel scape.